Hello everyone and welcome to Lesson 5.3A. I've entitled this video, The Shot Around the World. This video is going to cover pages 120 to 123. A meeting in Philadelphia. In September 1774, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia. They had come to set up a political body that would represent Americans and challenge British control. The delegates called this body the Continental Congress. And notice this is 20 years after Ben Franklin's join-or-die Albany plan was defeated by every colony. Well, 20 years later, they've wised up and they've decided it's time to band together. Question number 1. In September of 1774, where did 55 delegates meet? Philadelphia. Number 2. Why did these delegates meet? They came to set up a group that would represent the Americans and challenge some of the things the British had been doing. Question 3. What do historians call this meeting? They call it the First Continental Congress. Now, they called it the Continental Congress, but eventually we're going to call this the First Continental Congress because there will be a second one. Leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies attended the meeting. Only Georgia did not send a representative. Massachusetts sent fiery Samuel Adams, right here, and his lawyer cousin John Adams, the one who represented the Boston Massacre soldiers. New York sent John Jay, a very important figure in American politics, would eventually become our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Another lawyer. Virginia sent George Washington, maybe you've heard of him, as well as Richard Henry Lee. If you haven't heard of him, he's the one that's actually going to give forth the Declaration of Independence resolution in the Congress. And Patrick Henry, of famed Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. Two outspoken defenders of colonial rights. Patrick Henry wanted the colonies to unite in firm resistance to Britain. He summed up the meaning of the meeting when he addressed the delegates on his second day. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not Virginian, but an American. Question number 4. How many of the colonies sent delegates, and which colonies did not send delegates? 12 of the 13 did attend. The only one that did not was Georgia. Question 5. Name 6 of the famous delegates that were part of the First Continental Congress. You had Samuel Adams, John Adams, John Jay, George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, and Patrick Henry. Question number 6. What was the main point of the Patrick Henry quote on this slide? The main meaning of that quote is we were no longer separate 13 colonies, but united as colonies. They were going to be united as American colonies. The delegates vote. The delegates discussed complaints against the British. Then they voted. In a statement of grievances, the delegates called for the repeal of 13 acts of Parliament. They believed these laws violated the, quote, laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the several charters of the colonies. The delegates also voted to boycott British trade. The colonies would not import or use any British goods, nor would they sell their goods in Great Britain. Continental Congress delegates also decided to endorse the Suffolk Resolves, prepared by the people of Boston and other Suffolk County towns in Massachusetts. These resolutions declared the coercive acts to be illegal. They called on the country's residents to arm themselves against the British. After delegates endorsed the resolves, other colonies also organized militias, which are groups of citizen soldiers. And now we can answer a couple of questions. Question 7. What were 5 things the delegates did at the First Continental Congress? Well, number 1, they talked about complaints that they had against the British. Secondly, they voted on issues. Third, they issued a statement of grievances against Parliament asking for the repeal of 13 different acts. They also voted to boycott British trade, so they would not import or use any British goods, nor would they sell their goods to Great Britain. And they also decided to endorse the Suffolk Resolves, which basically said that coercive acts were illegal. And they finally called on the peoples of the colonies to arm themselves against the British, to form militias. Which gives us to the next question. What does the word militia mean? A militia is a group of armed citizen soldiers. The colonial militias. American colonists had a long tradition of serving and protecting their communities in militias. Members of a militia were an important part of each town's defense. Militia members trained and had drills with the other citizen soldiers. They practiced using muskets, pictured here in the bottom right, and cannons, pictured on the top right. Each member was required to provide his own weapon, usually a musket, and ammunition. Later, as tension between Britain and the colonies grew, towns began to gather and store military supplies. Question number 9. What were some of the things members of a militia did back then? Well, what they did was they trained together. They had drills with the other citizens together. They practiced using the weapons such as muskets and cannons. They had to provide their own weapon and ammunition. I thought that was interesting. Fighting begins. Many colonists believed that if fighting with the British were to break out, it would happen in New England. Militias in Massachusetts held drills, made bullets, and stockpiled weapons. Some militias were known as Minutemen because they boasted they would be ready to fight at a minute's notice. In the winter of 1774 and 1775, a British officer stationed in Boston noted in his diary, primary source from Diary of Frederick Mackenzie, 1775, "These people are evidently making every preparation for resistance. They are taking every means to provide themselves with arms." Question number 10. Most colonists believed that if fighting with the British was going to happen, it would happen in which of the colonies? The New England colonies. Question 12. What were 3 actions taken by the Massachusetts militia to prepare for possible conflicts? Well, number 1, they held drills. Number 2, they made bullets. And 3, they stockpiled or collected weapons. Question 12. What were the Minutemen? The Minutemen were the group of soldiers that took on that nickname. They were militiamen, and they said, listen, if there is fighting, we will be ready within a minute's notice. So thus, Minutemen. Great Britain sends troops. The British also got ready for a fight. King George told Parliament that the New England colonies were, quote, in a state of rebellion, and that, quote, blows must decide. Who would control America? By April 1775, several thousand British troops were in and around Boston, with more on the way. British General Thomas Gage had orders to seize the weapons from the Massachusetts militia and arrest the leaders. Gage learned that the militia stored arms and ammunition at Concord, a town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. And you can see that pictured on the map here. Here's Boston. Here's Concord. Here's Lexington. That's going to be famous as well. He ordered 700 troops under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, quote, to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all the artillery and ammunition you can find. And so you can see the path that Smith is going to take to get to Concord. Question number 13. What were the 2 orders given to British General Thomas Gage at that time? He was told to, quote, seize the weapons, number 1, and secondly, arrest the leaders. Number 14. Where did General Gage send 700 of his troops to seize arms and ammunition? He sent them to Concord. The British on the move. On the night of April 18th, 1775, colonial protest leader Dr. Joseph Warren walked through Boston. Watching for any unusual activity by the British, he saw troops marching out of the city. Warren alerted Paul Revere and William Dawes, members of the Sons of Liberty. Revere and Dawes rode to Lexington, a town east of Concord, to spread the word that the British were coming. Revere galloped across the countryside, shouting his warning of the approaching troops. Hearing the news, Samuel Adams said, quote, what a glorious morning this is. He was ready to fight. A British patrol later captured Dawes and Revere. Another rider named Samuel Prescott carried the warning to Concord. Question 15. What roles did Dr. Warren, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott all play on April 18th, 1775? They took on the role of warning. Basically, they took the role of, hey, here they come, the British are on their way, let's be prepared, they are coming. And so they were a warning group. Lexington and Concord. Meanwhile, the British continued their march. At dawn, the Redcoats approached Lexington. There, they ran into about 70 waiting Minutemen. Led by Captain John Parker, the Minutemen stood on the town common with muskets in hand. Badly outnumbered, the Minutemen were about to give way to the Redcoats. Just then, a shot was fired. From where? is still not clear. Both sides let loose an exchange of bullets. When the shooting ended, 8 Minutemen lay dead. The British continued on to Concord, while some troops burned the few weapons they found. The others met a group of Minutemen waiting at the North Bridge. In a short battle, the British took heavy losses. They began to make their way back to Boston. All along the road, colonists hid behind trees and fired on the soldiers. By the time the Redcoats reached Boston, at least 174 were wounded and 73 were dead. About 60 years later, poet Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in the Concord Hymn that the Americans at Lexington and Concord had fired the, quote, shot heard round the world. The battle for independence had begun. Question 16. What happened at Lexington on the morning of April 19th, 1775? Well, the Minutemen and the British Redcoats exchanged gunfire, and several people were dead after that. Question 17. What happened at Concord on the morning of April 19th, 1775? The Redcoats and the Minutemen again exchanged fire, and this time a lot of British soldiers were killed and many were wounded. Question 18. What war began with the shot heard round the world? We call it the American Revolutionary War or the Revolutionary War. And here we see a map of the first battles of the Revolution. Here you can see Boston and the trip taken by the British soldiers to get to Lexington and eventually to Concord. And then you can see all the spots where there were battles as the British retreated back to Boston. Feel free to pause the video at this time if you'd like to take a look at this map a little bit more. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we leave, of course, I've got a meme for you. We're here to take your guns. Oh, sure. Start with the ammunition. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.